Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mikolaj Wrzecionkowski. I'm the Associate Officer on Freedom of Religion or Belief at OSCE ODIHR, which is the institution that was responsible for developing and publishing the policy guidance on freedom of religion or belief and security, which is the publication at the very heart of today's conference. Now, we were very much delighted when we first heard that the Institute of Europe at the Russian Academy of Science decided to go ahead with this conference, to structure it around this very important theme and to analyze our cherished publication. I was really looking forward to joining you in person in Moscow during this conference, but unfortunately, as you know, due to very unusual current circumstances, all OSCE staff have been prevented from official duty travel. So I have to address you through this video link, and I really regret that I can't be with you in person. Now, in this very short video address, what I wanted to do is three simple things. First, to tell you the reasons why actually our institution decided to go ahead with devising and publishing this important publication. What were the reasons behind that? Secondly, I want to quickly take you through the content of it, although I'm sure most of the participants are by now well acquainted with this publication. And finally, tell you a little bit about our plans in relation to our future work on the basis of this document, and hopefully maybe even our future cooperation with some of the participants or organizers of this conference. So just to start off, why ODIHR decided to go ahead with devising and publishing this policy guidance? Initially, we were very concerned in our day-to-day work because we've noticed a lot of conceptual confusion, not only around what the nature, the status, and the scope of the right to freedom of religion or belief, as it is enshrined in international human rights standards was, but also its relationship with security. And we've also time and again noticed that a lot of experts had a hard time understanding whether national security is a legitimate ground for limiting this right or not. So we really wanted to clarify this as a starting point. But that was only just the beginning. In recent years, we have observed quite a number of negative challenges across the OSCE region, which had a very negative impact on the right to freedom of religion or belief, and that have put the relationship between this right and security into sharp focus. Now, I have listed a number of these on my PowerPoint presentation, which I have shared with Stas, and I hope that he will be able to distribute it to you. And the time does not allow for me to go into each and one of them, but all of these really fell into three main clusters that I can point out here and can be grouped in these three categories. Number one, the big trend that we have observed was the increased securitization of religion. And there are two strands here. The first is that certain states simply view religion as a source of trouble, of violence, and they impose very heavy security parameters around religious or belief communities, which then has a very negative effect on their ability to enjoy this right. But also conversely, in recent years, we have seen a number of violent attacks which were targeted at places of worship or particular religious or belief communities, which then forced states to really impose very strict and heavy security parameters around these communities or places of worship. And that in turn had a negative effect on some of these communities to manifest their religion or belief. So that's one big trend. Secondly, we observed a view that has gained quite a bit of notoriety in recent years, especially certain political parties propagating this, that certain religions or beliefs simply do not belong in the traditional makeup of certain societies. And also, additionally to that, the narrative that religious or belief pluralism is not something to be cherished or celebrated, but viewed with suspicion and that should really be suppressed. So that's the second big trend. And finally, we have observed a a number of states across the region using very vague or ill-defined or undefined terms such as extremism to really suppress legitimate religious activities and really put undue restraint on the right to freedom of religion or belief of communities that are peaceful, mostly to really gain control over society. So these three big trends have really led us to believe that we have to devise a tool that will deal with the interrelationship between security and freedom of religion or belief. Much of the discourse that has evolved in recent years has really portrayed freedom of religion or belief and security as two mutually exclusive values. If one is advanced, the second has to be limited, that there have to be trade-offs made. And that's not how the OSCE views this issue. So with this in mind, we came up with a document or a publication that would do three simple but very profound things. Number one is that we really wanted to clarify the nature and the status and the scope of the right to freedom of religion or belief, its main parameters, and how it is structured in international human rights law. Then we wanted to clarify what OSCE understands to be the notion of comprehensive security, and to look at the interrelationship between the two, and finally to provide guiding principles and practical guidance at 4 issues at the intersection between freedom of religion or belief and security. And with these 3 in mind, we held very extensive consultation between 2016 and 2018. We held 9 consultation events. We've consulted over 160 professionals from a variety of backgrounds and translated their generous expertise into this tool that you have in front of you today, that's also been translated into Russian. So just to start with the structure of this document and its key parameters. As I said, we wanted to clarify first and foremost what freedom of religion or belief is, and for most experts this may not be necessary, but a lot of people really do not understand the way it is structured, that it has an internal dimension which is absolute, that it has the external manifestation which can be limited but only in very limited circumstances, that it protects individuals and not religions and such, that it's a universal human right. All of this is explained in this document, but then also it talks about what we talk about when we talk about security. And as you may know, the OSCE has a very particular take on this. It doesn't view security in this very narrow sense which typically prevails, and that is the day-to-day security of individuals, but rather it looks at a very more comprehensive approach to security. It's a very long-term concept. As you know, it has 3 dimensions: the political, military, the economical, environmental, and the human dimensions, which are all indivisible and mutually reinforcing. And it looks at security as a long-term but also a very comprehensive security of whole societies and states as such, and not just the individual security. So that is something that has to be borne in mind. And when it comes to the interrelationship between the two, it's a very circular logic here, because as with all other human rights, it's almost inconceivable to think that you can protect, respect, protect, and fulfill human rights if you don't have that comprehensive security regime in place. But equally, if you limit human rights in undue ways, this will also have a negative impact on security in the long term, simply because trust that underpins the relationship between the state and the population that it serves can be broken, and a lot of security challenges can ensue in the mid or long term as a result. So it's very important to bear this in mind. And this is the first part that deals with these important issues. Secondly, the policy guidance looks at principles. It's a very important part of this publication. It relates to awareness raising initiatives. It looks at educational initiatives. It also looks at the legal framework, and these principles also relate to what we call the whole of society approach. So something I didn't mention before is we devised this tool with policymakers in mind, and that's our primary audience. But a lot of recommendations that are in the document are also related at religious or belief communities, at civil society, at academia, and also the media, which is first for ODIHR, for our guidance to be directed also at media professionals. And this is very important to remember. And I would encourage everyone to look carefully at all the principles that are there. I unfortunately don't have the time to delve into details here. And then the third and probably the most important part of the policy guidance is the 4 issues which I've mentioned before at the intersection that you will also analyze throughout the course of this conference. The first being registration, of course. This is something we observe, we have been observing for the past few years. It's still very much, a lot of people would think registration is a technical or administrative issue, but in fact it's a very powerful tool in the hands of governments to impose restrictions on the right to freedom of religion or belief of individuals and communities, simply because if you have a very burdensome registration regime in place, which is coupled with criminal liability for unregistered activities, it really gives a hard time to small communities which first of all cannot register first, but then they face criminal charges if they do something without being registered. So it's a circular, kind of vicious circle for them. And that's what we deal with in this document. The second important issue is the issue of extremist speech. We look at how governments assess religious literature, the whole issue about superiority claims and how best to deal with that. Also, the government appointed experts who assess literature, but also the issue of criminalizing the incitement to hostility, discrimination, hostility, or violence, which is very important, and we really take you through that through the lens of international human rights law. Then, of course, searching places of worship, a very, very important issue. If not done right, it can have a lot of negative consequences. So we put a lot of recommendations for states to be very careful in how they approach this issue so they avoid trouble in the long term. And finally, the issue of conversion. We really stress that the right to convert is part of the so-called forum internum, so it's absolute. And it cannot be restricted in any circumstances, and also the right to persuade others in a way that is non-coercive also enjoys protection by freedom of expression. So these 4 issues are very key and important, and there are certain principles that run through the veins of all 4 of them, which I wanted to also highlight here, which I think are very important in this document. Number 1 is that states really should not attribute blame if there's individual misconduct within communities. They shouldn't blame the entire community. So that's number 1. Second, states should really distinguish between thoughts and deeds, especially when it comes to the whole issue of extremism. And third, and probably the most important thing, is that states should really carefully assess their actions in terms of looking at the so-called second-order consequences. So they should really not look at how their actions may result in the short term, but if there can be some unintended consequences in the long term. And one more maybe, which I forgot, is also of course, the use of extremism and other vague or undefined concepts is also very, very problematic from the standpoint of international human rights law. And this, in very simplified, shortened terms, is what this document is all about. Now, I also said that I wanted to tell you a little bit about our plans in relation to this document. What I wanted to stress first and foremost is that this is not the last word on this issue, but it's really an opening. It's a start. We wanted to start a conversation with policymakers, with the academia, with religious or belief communities, with civil society, on looking at starting to have this mindset shift, not look at freedom of religion or belief and security as mutually exclusive, but as mutually reinforcing values that can be advanced together. You will probably have noticed that the cover has a braided rope on it, and that symbolizes this relationship where the two are intertwined and advanced together. We really are now looking to raise awareness about these issues. That's why we're so delighted that this conference in Moscow is going ahead. We want to start developing a training module on the basis of this policy guidance, as well as a document that will go into detail on how to operationalize the advice that is given there. So all the recommendations can be made, translated into a very practical step-by-step guide. We started working on that, and really looking also into the future to have more awareness-raising initiatives around the policy guidance. So with this, I wish you very productive discussions. We really look forward to receiving the outputs from the conference. I understand there will be also a document that will stem from it, so we really look forward to reading that. And also, I encourage you to get in touch with me or Kishan, is senior advisor. If you really want to collaborate with us on this topic, we are open, and we typically try to say yes to everything that comes our way. And again, I want to apologize for not being able to be there in person, for potential background noise from my son, but as you may know also, we cannot work from our office at the moment, so I'm giving this speech from my home. And just thank you once again for organizing this, and I hope that we will be able to collaborate in the future. Thank you very much.